I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
You try and channel it for
You will
good.
see a persistent of gains in
deny
the
what they
formula
think is
economy.
false, argue what
Let
they
me
think is
assert
false.
my
You have
firm
to have
belief that the only
free
thing we have to
and
fear
uncorrupted communication.
I would like to first begin by expressing my gratitude to Dean Mel Oliver and Ms. Robin Rogers for making today's event possible. Today is actually the 30th anniversary of our family's arrival to the United States, and so I think it's fitting that John and I celebrate this time by discussing the nation's continually shifting immigration policy. It is also fitting in another way. When our mother passed away 6 years ago, John and I talked about how families such as ours, coming to the U.S. with a single mom, with no certifiable skills, with negative net worth that was the cost of our plane tickets, with a sponsor who herself was of very modest means, could ever immigrate to the U.S. under the prevailing immigration policies that privileges the wealthy and the skilled and imposes an income test and an affidavit of financial support for sponsors. That conversation became the basis of the book that we are presenting today. There are two main but ultimately conflicting narratives about U.S. immigration policy. On the one hand, as every elementary school children can tell you, U.S. is the nation of immigrants. In this account of U.S. immigration policy, etched in the Statue of Liberty, the U.S. was committed to open and then fair immigration policy that welcomed all of the world's people, even those who some might consider wretched. Open and fair immigration policy would be based on humanitarian concerns, commitment to fair play and equal opportunity, and a conviction that U.S. would be a transformative place that could take the poorest of immigrants and reward them with the American dream. On the other hand, as every UCSB student who fulfilled the American history and institutions requirement knows, the other narrative of American immigration policy tells a completely different story. In this narrative, U.S. immigration policies were always built on a set of restrictions that the political leaders used to express the prevailing interest of the nation. In the U.S., much of these restrictions were built on race and ethnicity, class and wealth, and international relations and domestic anxieties. The list of formal laws and administrative practices on this score is enormous. But some of the highlights include the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that first named a specific ethnic group for exclusion, the Barred Zone Act of 1917 that extended the exclusion over an entire race of people, and the Origin Act of 1924, that National Origin Act of 1924, that provided differential treatment over more or less desirable whites. On the axis of other than race and ethnicity, all traders and merchants were generally exempted from exclusion, even during the most restrictive periods. And the most dynamic periods of change occurred during times of war, when foreign policy goals were pursued through immigration rules, cracking open the door to Chinese immigration during World War II, and of course opening it wider during the Cold War. For American social scientists, the Immigration Act of 1965 served as a way to discuss the two impulses in the U.S. immigration policy. For those who have argued that U.S. immigration policies were about fairness and inclusion, the act served as proof. Doing away with race-based quota and emphasizing family reunification and plight of the refugees highlighted those impulses. However, the Act also contained provisions for exceptional individuals, the skilled workers, and the workers that were in need by the U.S. labor market, giving pause to those who thought the Act left the door open for a more instrumental deployment. During the late 1970s, as the family reunification numbers grew and the immigration stream became dramatically diverse on both race and class-based terms, the U.S. experienced the most inclusive and diverse migration stream in the history of the nation. And today, we live in an America that has been remade during this time through this law. Even in the early 1980s, many social scientists saw the end of history when it came to the broad pattern of U.S. immigration policy. While anxieties abounded over issues of cultural assimilation, economic cost, and political integration, it seemed that the fundamental principles of U.S. immigration policy, namely of racial and ethnic inclusion and class-based fairness, were bedrock principles that were unshakable. However, like most declaration of end of history, this too was premature. Beginning in the mid-1980s, as the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 was being debated, U.S. Congress began to question whether the nation can live with the fundamental principles that were being manifest from the Immigration Act of 1965. From this point on, U.S. would begin to rethink its immigration policy in ways that are both fundamental and incremental. To document these changes, I'll turn the rest of the presentation to John.
Again, I want to begin by expressing my thanks to everyone for being here, and especially for Professor Oliver and for Ms. Rogers for organizing this event. What I'm going to do now is go over basic changes to immigration law, the essential topic of Probationary Americans, to show you how, in many respects, American immigration policy admits more immigrants than ever before. I mean, in terms of the whole scale of immigration. And this is something I tell my students. The United States has admitted more immigrants over the past 20 years than in any other point in its history. It's the kind of immigrants that it's admitting, the various fundamental changes in its rules that shift and have sifted through various classes of immigrants that is so striking. Right? And it's in that kind of thing and in the details of those things that I'll turn to now. Right. The book itself and my talk begins with the Immigration Act of 1990. The Immigration Act of 1990 is a fundamental shift in immigration law that moves in the general trajectory of the immigration rules that we have now. The first thing that it did was, prior to the Immigration Act of 1990 and since 1965, employment-based immigration to the United States, that is, persons who wanted to come to the United States permanently to work, 54,000 visas were set aside for them every year. The Immigration Act of 1990 raised that by almost 200%, so 140,000 would subsequently enter under that rule, under those provisions. The Immigration Act of 1990 was novel for other reasons, one of which is the creation of investor visas. So in an effort to attract capital, Congress thought it'd be a good idea that if you had $1 million and you're from a foreign country and you wanted to invest that in the United States, there's a special visa set aside for you. Right? So in both ways, the United States embraced a wealthier class and a more highly educated, skilled class of workers in a way that it hadn't done before. Right? The other change to the Immigration Act in the Immigration Act of 1990 was a special provision for what were considered temporary workers. Right? This is under the familiar H-1B program, but the way the H-1B program was originally written in the Act of 1990, it was meant for like specialty occupations, and it names things like fashion designers and models and things like that, sometimes athletes. It wasn't really conceived of as anything uniquely special. But by 1992 and then 1994, high-tech companies began using the H-1B to have a greater and greater share of people coming to the United States, ostensibly to work temporarily, but in the high-tech industry, right? And these visas were originally set aside at 65,000 persons per year. Right. By the time the high-tech industry had discovered this particular visa, it was beginning to run out at a quicker and quicker rate. Right. So companies like Microsoft, Intel, Sun Microsystems were using this visa to increase the total number of workers that they were hiring from abroad. Right? And they felt that this was actually quite indispensable to the survival of the industry. I saw this myself. I started working at a law firm in San Francisco, and then when we were working at this law firm, we discovered that high-tech firms in San Francisco were using this visa at a clip. Right? And typically the visas were made available at the beginning of the fiscal year, which is October 1st. They were beginning to run out. So in 1997, they ran out like around May. Then in 1998, they began running out in, December. Like the moment they were made available, all these companies used them up. In an effort to increase the cap, Congress responded in 1998 and in 2000 by raising the total number of people who could come temporarily to work in the United States. Right? By the time of the American Competitiveness in the 21st Century Act, which is called AC 21, we're talking about close to 200,000 persons were coming to work temporarily in the United States. Now, these people coming to work temporarily as skilled labor in the United States were different. By and large, they had college degrees. They were more likely than not had master's degrees or better. Many of them were working in the computer science industry where salaries were very high. Right? On average, for H-1B petitioners in our law firm who were coming in, they were earning about $60,000 a year. And the other most notable thing is that 70% of them were from Asia. Right? They were coming at a clip from a place that had traditionally been a kind of barred zone. Right? So this was one way in which American law was really profoundly embracing skilled labor in a way that it had never before. The other strange thing about the H-1B is that about half of all H-1B recipients would eventually adjust. That is, in the parlance of immigration law, if you came in as a temporary worker, you could, over time, if you found a sponsoring company, shift or adjust your status to a permanent resident. Right? Because of that particular provision, many of these temporary workers were finding permanent jobs and were getting their companies to sponsor them to become immigrants. Yeah. Because of that change, since about 2000, more people have adjusted into permanent residency than have actually come from abroad originally. Right? That's a fundamental change in American law. Yeah. That this temporary avenue toward entry into the United States is becoming more like a way toward permanent residency. Yeah. Yeah, in any given year now, from 2000, 2003, and for the most recent year that we have data, about 60 to 70% of all employment-based workers were coming from Asia, right, both as temporary workers or as skilled workers. In addition to that, of the persons that were coming as investors, that special category that I was telling you about earlier, typically in any given year, over half will come from Asia, right? Again, it's not as though, we tend to talk about American immigration law as being restrictionist. That's not, it's too simplistic to think of it that way. It is restrictionist in some ways, but in other ways it has been wholeheartedly embracing of skills and capital in a way that's never before. Yeah. Actually, Ed and I are working on a grant now that looks at this process. And any of you from LA or from the Bay Area, you might know what we're talking about in terms of just how neighborhoods in California or cities in California have fundamentally changed in terms of how they look, right? If you go to LA in Koreatown, Howard Winant was mentioning a few minutes ago how it's just become very expensive to live there. Right? The population of Korean foreign investors is actually at a clip. They come at like 20,000 persons per year. Among persons from China, it could be as high as 30,000 persons per year. Many of them have to show that they have a substantial amount of money to come. And in places like in the San Gabriel Valley, along Valley Boulevard, in Arcadia, all right? In these kinds of places, this new wave of very affluent migrants, in many ways, forces us to rethink the position of Asians again, right? If anything, if these trends hold, Asian American scholars, academics, as well as public policy people will have to rethink, are Asians a model minority? To what extent is immigration law engineering a kind of model minority? Yeah. And so those are the kinds of issues that we deal with in the first part of our book about high-end migration. Right? The second part about the book is that part that deals with restrictions. Right? And it's about how immigration law has tended to reduce or eliminate the poor. Yeah. Here on the handout that I gave to you, there are two rules that govern welfare. The first rule was signed into law by President Clinton in 1996. It's the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Right? It was in many ways the wording of the act, the title of the act was inspired by the Contract with America, right, which Newt Gingrich and his friends wrote in the wake of their stunning electoral victory in 1994 when Republicans became a majority of Congress. Yeah. In the Contract with America, there's all this stuff about responsibility, how people needed to be more responsible. And certainly this trickled into both welfare reform and immigration law. Right? The first act of it, the first part of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, was to cut off eligibility for most forms of public assistance for 10 years for any new immigrant arriving to the United States. All right, so from now on, anyone who's from a foreign country who's on either an employment-based visa or for family reunification is presumptively ineligible for welfare for the next 10 years. Yeah. Again, this was designed to, the rule was passed again in the wake of Prop 187 in California in 1994, where California voters overwhelmingly approved a measure that would have denied public education to undocumented school children, as well as denying all public assistance in general to undocumented children. Yeah. Because of that, in some sense, Democrats were in a state of retreat. When they agreed to these immigration rules, President Clinton himself said that this was pretty draconian, but his political hands were tied at the moment, right? This was part of ending welfare as we know it, and this meant for immigrants a complete cutting off of any kind of public assistance. Yeah. Oh, and it gave states a great deal of discretion to cut off welfare or various forms of public assistance to immigrants as they saw fit. Yeah. But in general, they would be presumptively ineligible. The other rule is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996. It was passed about 2 months after the Welfare Act. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act had certain provisions that Ed alluded to earlier in his discussion. That is, imagine my aunt. In the language of the immigration law, my aunt was living in the United States, and she was our sponsor. Right? Our family, her sister, or my mother, was the immigrant beneficiary. Right? In that sense, my aunt had to say that she would be now financially responsible for any beneficiary that she petitions to come to the United States. Under the new rule in 1996, the immigrant sponsor, or the immigrant beneficiary, and the American citizen or legal resident sponsor are tied for the next 10 years. Yeah. That is, say my mother had to rely on welfare, or that my family had to rely on welfare. The state agencies that provided us welfare could then sue my aunt to recover those costs. Right? Not only that, we could sue our aunt to cover those costs if we became indigent or otherwise relied on public assistance. Moreover, in order to be a sponsor now, after the rule in 1996, my aunt would have had to prove through her tax returns that her income was 125% above the federal poverty line. Right? If you apply this kind of threshold income test, about half of all immigrant families in the United States would flunk. That is, they would not earn enough income to justify becoming a sponsor at all. Yeah. This kind of binding affidavit of support, the minimum income threshold requirements, account for why family migration from Asia fell by a third in the subsequent years after the Act of 1996. Yeah. Family-based immigration, the reunification of families, tended to dominate migration from Asia from the period between 1965 all the way through about 1994. Right? After 1996, migration from Asia is now dominated by employment. Right? And family unification has receded in importance because of these rules. Right? The other rules that we talk about in the book have more to deal with deportation. Right, and the eliminating of poor people from the United States. Yeah. The rule about the Responsibility Act in 1996, there's also an Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, passed, by the way, in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombings 10 years ago. These rules accelerate and make much easier deportation. Right? It's not even called deportation anymore, it's called removal. So in the past, you were deported from the United States. Now you're just removed. Yeah, removal means, and how can you be removed? In the past, if you committed a crime for which the sentence could be, or if you had a sentence of 5 years, then you could be removed. Nowadays, if you commit a crime for which the sentence could be 1 year, that is, you don't have to serve the sentence for 1 year, but if you committed a crime for which the sentence could be 1 year, then you're removable. Yeah, the threshold has really fallen. I mean, even minor crimes. I tell my undergraduates that if you're a non-citizen and you get caught with pot in your dorm, you could be removable for that. You know, if you're a drunk driver, you could be removed for that. Yeah, at least, you know, even minor felonies that could trigger just a 1-year sentence are now enough to get you kicked out of the country. In the context of our book, we talked about how these removal proceedings and expedited removal allowed for a greater, not just a greater universe of people who could be excised from the United States, but it touched upon vulnerable populations as well. So imagine Southeast Asian refugees who came to the United States in 1980. Right, Southeast Asian refugees who came to the United States in 1980, many of them were minors when they came to the United States. They were 3 or 4 years old. Right? Say they commit a crime when they're 20 years old, and they never bothered to adjust into American citizenship. Now, they only know the United States. Should they subsequently be deported? Right? These are the kinds of issues that have come up in recent years. Increasingly, the federal courts have replied that their hands are tied. Right? In other separate provisions of the immigration rule, in the Responsibility Act of 1996, for example, anyone who has a criminal conviction cannot appeal their deportation or their removal. Right? It's a door that's closing. Yeah? Anyone who's committed a crime, in the past, the rule tended to be if there was hardship. That is, if I say I committed a crime, I'm removable, but if Ed really needed me because he was sick or he was, you know, and I was his only source of support, then I could plead to a federal court and say my removal would cause him unnecessary hardship, and he's an innocent party here, he shouldn't be harmed by my deportation. In those instances, the federal courts often said, okay, if there is harm to an American citizen or lawful permanent resident, then there'd be relief from deportation, right? Now it's called cancellation of removal. But if I'm convicted of a crime, that's not an option that's available. Right? This in part accounts for why the United States has deported more people than ever before in its history. Right? Deportation is happening at a clip. And just to give you a sample of these numbers, between 1960 and 1970, about 100,000 persons were removed. Right? In 1996, fewer than 30,000 persons were, or 3,000 persons, I'm sorry, were removed. But since 1997, the United States has forcibly removed more than 167,000 persons every year. Yeah. And this doesn't even count people who, what's called voluntary departure. Voluntary departure is where the INS catches you, it's going to remove you, but you voluntarily leave, right? If we include people who are voluntarily departed, add to that figure of 167,000 persons per year, about 1 million persons who leave voluntarily. Yeah. there's been a great deal of attention to border enforcement. Now, I'm sure if you read the LA Times, you'll see those reports about Arizona and people driving around in pickup trucks with binoculars looking for people to deport. Well, you know, the vast majority of people who are removable are not in that kind of setting. Most people now who are removed from the United States forcibly, it's a much more even transition. They finish a criminal conviction, right, a state sentence. They're handed over to immigration authorities who process their deportation, and then they're almost seamlessly removed from the United States. Yeah, actually, right now there's a federal facility in Lompoc where immigration detainees are held and then, I guess, taken to LAX. Right? I don't think they fly out of Santa Barbara. In conclusion, these immigration rules, and really this is where we'll stop. I mean, immigration law itself is incredibly complicated. It's, I think, second only to the tax code in the amount of complexity. So I can talk all day about the minutiae of immigration policy. The very essence of the argument, or the very core of the argument, is that the United States immigration law, as it was written in 1965, its very basic humanitarian concerns no longer really hold. Right? If anything, American immigration law is now much more calculating. It is what Professor Oliver referred to as much more like a cost-benefit analysis. People who can benefit the United States, people who bring capital or skills to the United States that are highly desirable, they're the ones who get to come. Right? And they're coming in large, large numbers. And they're mostly Asian. Yeah? On the other hand, there's a great wave and a great tendency to exclude persons who are poor. Yeah, and to move away from family unification as a fundamental structure in American immigration law, and a much more zealous tendency to throw out people who, for any minor reason, may do something bad when they're in the United States. And, you know, in some instances, it's rather bizarre. People who are being removed now, oftentimes they're removed in the context of what were naturalization proceedings. That is, they had a conviction in the past, but that was like 10 years ago, right? So 10 years ago, they had a conviction for, say, like larceny or something, you know, that they did when they were kids. But 10 years later, when they petition for American citizenship, they have to list whatever criminal convictions they have, right? A number of people who have been subsequently removed in the United States were actually petitioning to become American citizens. And in the course of exposing themselves to the INS or the Immigration Service, found that they were going to be removed from the United States, not to stay permanently. Right? So these are the kinds of contradictions and ironies that are very common now in American immigration law. And as we wrote the book together, it did occur to us that we hope this book will generate, and it's a very slim volume. You know, we hope the book generates a great deal of discussion about where the United States is headed. Not just in terms of its immigration policy, but whether the United States can really say anymore that we are a land of opportunity. Yeah. I don't know that the United States ever truly was that to begin with, but at least in 1965, there was a progressive tendency in the law. You know, the Immigration Act of 1965 was part of this great civil rights revolution, and perhaps, sadly, the retreat from that, as we see in these immigration policies, is what we're seeing. Okay? And so with that, I'll turn over the presentation now to Professor Winant.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to take part in this first Social Science Division public policy briefing, which I see as a very important new project, new program that we have going in the university. Also, I want to congratulate the Brothers Park for a very important intervention in the field of immigration studies. I see this too as a large step, but it's also only one of our early steps, one of the first steps towards an ongoing focus here on the UCSB campus, and particularly in social sciences, but not only, I suppose, on immigration studies and migration studies. My central point is going to be to place this work of Ed and John in the context of the absolute centrality of immigration and immigration issues in the making and remaking of American society, and in some sense world society, but I'll focus on the United States. In the US, though elsewhere as well, this is true, immigration and migration in general is a completely central type of action. It's personal and collective, political, economic, cultural action, cultural practice, all rolled into one. These are sort of familiar themes to us, as has been mentioned. Developing an account of immigration, as the Park brothers have done, and this is, I think, one of the great things about their work is the overview they present, the framing, the sort of overall take, the theoretical take on different aspects of U.S. immigration policy today. Developing that requires us to look at immigration as a major arena of social regulation and social conflict. And by the way, nobody has mentioned, so please allow me to digress and mention that the book Probationary Americans is for sale here today, and I do want to encourage you all to pick up a copy. This is an extraordinary achievement, this work. So immigration is a very broad area, encompassing such issues as labor conflicts, labor policy, stratification and inequality, citizenship, and cultural exclusion and inclusion in American society. In sociology right now, we're coping, I say this a little sarcastically, we're coping with a new area of study called the new assimilationism, the argument that assimilation is the old kind of study of race was about assimilation. That's now coming back in an argument that we should be looking at immigration through the lens, again, of assimilation. I have major questions about that. Meanwhile, a new nativism is brewing in the U.S., principally against Latinos so far. The Minutemen phenomenon, Minutemen. I can't believe that we even have to use that term, Minutemen, a patriotic reference. It's not patriotic. We should be calling them the brown shirts or something like that. That's been mentioned. But obviously, it's not just Latinos. It may, in the long run, be a more anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, anti-Middle Eastern, anti-Iranian, and even anti-South Asian hostility and prejudice that we're looking at. Post 9/11 phenomena don't appear too much in the book that referred to, but I think we have to take that question very seriously into account as we think about immigration in the broader context. The major debates and conflicts about immigration today are emerging even among Republicans. And again, the intersection of immigration issues with general issues of politics and social policy is very wide and very deep. There is certainly support in the Republican Party for these brown shirts on the Mexican border. But there's also support in the Republican Party for open borders. How do we handle that? How do we analyze that? An interesting question is just how much anti-Chinese sentiment we have and will have in this country. Long, long history of nativism versus the Chinese. As has been mentioned already, Ed mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882 and its renewal and so on. as the Chinese economy outgrows and outcompetes the US and shifts take place out of dollars into euros or other currencies, or as struggles intensify around the exchange rate of the Chinese yuan, how will we see the treatment of the Chinese change in the United States to reflect those conflicts? Remember, people, the U.S. has always racialized its international conflicts in terms of its domestic race relations. So, these are just some thoughts. I don't have any serious criticisms of the Parks book. In fact, I think it is a model of clarity and economy. It's clearly focused, social scientific account, policy-oriented account, in contrast to the overtly political account I'm presenting here today. It beautifully frames and explains the current state of immigration policy and its evolution in the United States. And put very briefly, I think the great achievement of the Parks book is that they explain the current trends in immigration policy in terms of class relationships. That is, on the one hand, as John was discussing, the focus on skilled immigration, the encouragement of, and even recruitment of what I would like to call high human capital bearers, is one main theme in the book. And the second main theme is the repression, the exclusion of low-skilled immigrants, what we might call, I guess, low human capital bearers. And that level of repression, I want to say one thing about too, is truly shocking. The exclusion, the violence that is directed towards low human capital bearers, poor people, the traditional, give me your tired, your poor, your struggle, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free immigrants. What a contradiction we have in our society about that. This is directed against those who, in large measure, are simply arriving here at an inconvenient time. For those who migrated here in the past, the rest of us, almost the rest of us, except for Native Americans, I guess. And yet all that repression, all that exclusion, barely alters the flow of low capital immigrants. I think we have in the Parks book a really good theory, well, the core elements of a really good theory of immigration in the United States, and that will be developed further. That will be developed further in their work and in other work undertaken here on campus, and of course in other work being done elsewhere. It's being developed as well. I also think it's worth saying something about immigration on a global level, or migration on a global level. And let me finish with this comment. There's a lot of rethinking going on about migration as an ongoing political process on a global level. We in this country, for all our centrality and our own imaginations and our status as the world's last superpower and the hegemonic power in the world and all that, we're only one instance, we're only one part, however big, of a larger process, a global process of the movement, the flow of people around the world. When we look at global migration that way, and at U.S. immigration that way as well, it begins to look a little different. It begins to look not only like control and regulation from above, and I think that's obviously a very important question, a central question, although not the only question in the Parks book. But it also begins to look like pragmatic action, self-reflective action from below, that is, among migrants themselves. this is action that's being undertaken collectively by millions who today, as before, are undertaking tremendous shifts in their own lives based on their own and their families and their communities' reading of the global situation. It's not just economic action, although it is that, of course. It's also class action, class struggle in some sense, racial action, anti-racist in some sense, gender action, feminist in some ways. And we are starting to have literature about this, about how when families immigrate to the United States, there tends to be an empowering effect for women, especially if they're coming from more traditional societies where more traditional gender norms apply. So it's interesting to think of immigration as a popular practice as well as a policy arena. These two are not contradictory. They're deeply interwoven. And that suggests a whole range of political ideas in this time and place for new forms of democratization as well as threats for new forms of repression that are emerging. But these are all merely possible subjects for future work, both by the Parks and by others, hopefully some of you in this room. I'm very grateful to have this work, Probationary Americans, which already takes a very big step, a very long step down the road towards ongoing migration studies and immigration studies on this campus. Thank you.
About the relationship between the disciplining of low-wage workers who are already in the country and immigration policies, both in terms of who's coming in, who's kept out. Because it seems to me that it's absolutely fascinating that we have this, and I haven't, of course, worked out the whole relationship, maybe you have, of the circulation of people in these global circuits of exchange at the same time that we have a real disciplining of poor people, particularly African Americans born in the United States, rendering them unwanted or punishing them, the growth of prisons on one hand, the punishing aspects of welfare deform that some of us call it, happening at the same time that certain people are allowed in and certain people are encouraged to come in illegally, in essence, so that they're even undermining the labor force participation and the possible jobs for the lowest rung of workers within this country. So take just something like care work, something that I'm obsessed about, and the way, who now are the household workers. Of course, it depends where you are in the country. If you're in the East, it might be someone from Ghana or the Dominican Republic. If you're here, it's probably someone from Mexico or the Americas, replacing African American women who do not want those jobs, granted. But then you have welfare reform on top of this in pushing people. And of course, another way, so I'd like you to sort of address this relationship to what's happening in America's native-born poor, no matter their race, and these new immigration laws and regimes. So that's one thing. And the second is kind of just a side comment. Another way, of course, in which people within the United States, the more prosperous, benefit from undocumented workers in particular, is that if it wasn't for people who are working here as nannies and as household laborers, middle-class professional women couldn't go out to work.
Dean Oliver and I had a conversation, and we talked about the Crenshaw district in the 1950s and 60s, where Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, African Americans forged a political coalition that eventually saw Tom Bradley into City Hall. I think one of the sort of biggest concerns we have in the book is by, quote, engineering the model minority community among Asian Americans. You wonder what possibilities exist for this kind of coalition building or collaboration across these racial boundaries as sort of, structural facts are so different for these groups. I just completed a report, public policy report for Korean immigrant workers advocates, where I think these tensions are coming to a sort of a real crisis situation. So wealthy Asian investors are, of course, coming to places like Koreatown to seek investments and permanent residency. And that has literally driven up the real estate value that has resulted in the displacement of Latinos and African Americans. And in fact, Donald Sterling is now being sued by a coalition of residents who are arguing that he is doing this sort of on purpose to drive the Latinos and African Americans out so that, Koreatown becomes, Hancock Park East. And so I think these are very, very important questions. And I think what lies at the heart of all this are public policies. And I think forums like this are important because instead of viewing these processes and sort of throwing up in our hands and saying, this is the way of the world, I think what we try to do in our book is to point out very precisely what policies contributed to these patterns. And I tell my students at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles that in fact, median income in Mexico is much, much higher than the median income in China, right? And so it's just the inequalities that we see in a place like Los Angeles or in the United States has to do with sort of the selective policies that are pulling and pushing different population over time and space. And because policies are at the heart of it, I think engaged, enlightened policies can also undo, right, the most insidious aspects of these outcomes.
Yeah, if you were to do a political history in response to your question, I think in 1994, when Newt Gingrich and the Republican Party took control of Congress, the idea was responsibility. Right, and they had personal responsibility, family responsibility, immigrant responsibility, and it was this language, this rhetoric of responsibility, as though the poor themselves were at fault for being in their condition, or that immigrants were at fault for being poor and coming to the United States, or it's like it's their fault. And so the thing to do is to create a set of policies where they would increasingly take greater responsibility. It would be nice if we had a politics that in some ways turned it on its head and asked, are American voters being responsible? Are American consumers being responsible? When you buy your head of lettuce and you know that somebody did not get paid what they should have been paid to eat that and pick that head of lettuce that you are eating, is that a responsible thing to do? Yeah? Is it responsible to have a border control policy where certain areas are cut off, and you well know people who are crossing will now be forced into deserts and mountains, and you know they're going to die? Is that a responsible public policy? Right? That language of responsibility, we have to take a step back, and instead of saying, well, maybe the poor need to be more responsible, maybe the rest of us who are not as in such dire conditions, we should ask ourselves, who are more empowered, how should we behave in a more responsible, ethical way? And I'd say the current set of public policies that we have now are irresponsible.
Yeah, you're getting a sense of how we write it. So I think one of the ways in which we're most dramatically irresponsible is the deportation of criminal gang members across national borders. And so typically a lot of these gang members who are being deported came to the United States at a very early age, like John, who immigrated at the age of 5, who learned the gang life in the mean streets of places like Compton, right? And at the age of 22, we are deporting them to places like Mexico City,
El Salvador.
El Salvador, Guatemala. And so, you know, that's yet another kind of a global responsibility that I think America is, you know, it's just not in the mood to talk about. And
Can I say one thing also?
Sure.
I'm sorry. I think it's very important to understand, as we're hearing here, migration as an economic push-pull phenomenon. That is, the attraction of a better-off country that's the pull, and the difficulties of survival in a poorer country, that's the push. But it's also, from a sociological standpoint, the literature on migration has also stressed the social dimensions, to put these in the same framework as the economic dimensions is very, very crucial. At the sociological dimensions, we find that there are chains of migration. In other words, it's not an individual atomized decision to get up and move. By the way, a very difficult decision always to leave one's home, to leave one's country, to leave one's language group, to leave one's culture and mores, to go to a completely different place and attempt to fit in there and to survive there, takes a certain bravery and courage and skill at managing matters and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which a lot of the analysis of immigration is now focusing on, quote unquote, creaming the most desirable people, even at low income levels, from particular communities. But apart from that, a person who makes a move to immigrate, a family that makes a move to immigrate, will often be kind of a pioneer, will be sent by a community or sent by a larger family network, and will remit back to that community significant resources. Probably the most significant form of foreign aid in the world today, apart from military aid, which is something else we could talk about, is remittances from the developed countries, particularly the U.S., but also Europe, to Latin America, Central America, and Africa, and the Middle East, and so on as well, and Asia. So, and probably less to Asia, but not in every place, Philippines and so on, more so. So in this way, we have to look at immigration not as the wholesale transfer of people only, but also as a transfer of resources in both directions. And the return migration is a major factor in that as well. A lot of people who come to the United States to work do not intend to stay here forever, but to accumulate resources which they can then use in their home countries, their home villages, their home areas. What is this about? This is about global inequality, a policy that we are fostering through the World Trade Organization, NAFTA, and now the CAFTA, tremendous debate about the CAFTA proposal, the Central America Free Trade Association, a policy designed to increase the ability of capital to make money in U.S. capital to make money in Central America, and also simultaneously to lower wages there and lower wages here, thereby, as a side effect, generating increasing impetus to migrate to the United States from Central America, already a major source of migration. So we have to understand, again, my point is migration policy is social policy, it is labor policy, it is foreign policy, it is global economic policy, it is trade policy, it is welfare policy, it is housing policy, it is urban policy, it is education policy. It cannot be distinguished from any of these areas.
We have time for only one more question.
Okay. Well, mine segues from that. The implications of your book and your talk is for increased inequality, both in the United States, as these public policies are engineered to allow in legally the wealthier people, yet we know that the flows of illegal immigration are going to continue, as well as global inequality. And clearly these policies are occurring in a global context. And I was wondering if you could speak to shifts in global capitalism that are propelling some of these policy shifts. For example, when Asians were coming, or whereas low-income workers, right, there was a large need for labor in this country. But as manufacturing has shifted overseas, there's been this real shift, right? So I was wondering if you could speak to that and how the changes in the global economy are affecting, policy, and how that impacts, I want to know how that impacts countries, well, throughout the world as well, not just in the United States, but throughout the world as we get their high-skilled workers into this country.
I think at the heart of programs like H-1B visa program, and I think this is perhaps, sort of the most important point I want to make, is that historically America has had a social contract, and that is, if you're a foreigner and you work in America, your work is embodied, and we will take the person and the work together. And you will be a permanent resident. If you want to become a citizen, it's your choice. With these new set of policies, what we've done is we've divided the person and the labor, right? And so companies, high-tech companies could say, we want your labor for 6 years, but after that 6 years is done, we want you to go back, right? Or if you are so extraordinary, then we will invest in an immigration lawyer and allow you to stay permanently. And so I think the most important thing, sort of capitalism lies at the heart of that process, right? And so what this is about in the end is to benefit from foreigners' labor without, to use a kind of a neo-Marxist language, paying the reproductive cost of that person, right? Secondly, the most gross example of this, of course, is the investor visa. The idea that one could buy your way into America. It is unbelievable to think that even a few years ago that would have been unthinkable. In fact, I think a lot of Americans find that unbelievable now, that you can literally buy your way into America, right? And so in a world where there is capital shortage, if you invest $1 million, then you could become a permanent resident. And once again, I think it's a shocking kind of a transition in the policy of immigration, right? Having said all this, I think as immigrants myself, as ourselves, I think global immigration can be a very progressive thing. It could be a very powerful thing. And the contribution of immigrants to this country and the migration of people around the world, as I think has created a greater cosmopolitanism, greater economic well-being, and so so I think that needs to be said, because I really think it's important to not read our work as a work that is about anti-immigration and all of that. And so I think the real important thing is to have discussions like this, and to, I think, have a political debate and policy debate on immigration and how immigration policy ought to go. I think the most challenging question is, what is wrong with just bringing rich folks? What is wrong with just bringing skilled folks? Isn't America better off because of it, right? And I think the most challenging question is, what do we lose, right, by losing the poor immigrants or immigrants who aren't as skilled, right? Does that shift the quality of what it means to be an American or what it means to become an American? And I think those are, I think real challenging questions that I think all of us could discuss and debate.
Well, I want to thank everyone. This has been an interesting and complex argument. Immigration is probably one of the most difficult issues to wrap your arms around precisely because of Howie's comments. It encompasses so many policy dimensions. And the thing about your book is it cuts through a lot of them and puts a clear focus on something that we probably didn't know before we walked into this room, and we have a very different perspective on it now that we've read and heard your work. So I want to thank you. A real achievement, and he is selling books, by the way. Thank you, and
So
look
buy a
forward to
copy.
the next public policy briefing that we're going to have. Thank you.